The day my brother and I bought an abandoned Quonset hut for $5, I didn't realize we were standing on something people would eventually try to take from us. I just thought we were buying a rusted piece of nowhere because we had nowhere else to go. If you've ever felt like the world pushed you out before you were ready, like you had to build something out of nothing just to survive, then this story is for you. The day I turned 18, the system didn't celebrate, it processed me out. One minute I had a bed, rules, and a case file. The next, I had a black trash bag with my clothes, a worn pair of boots, and a handshake that felt more like a dismissal. It was early fall in western Montana, the kind of cold that sneaks in before winter officially arrives, and I stood outside the group home, watching my breath fog up in the air like proof that I was still there, still breathing, even if nobody seemed to care. Behind the glass door, my younger brother Caleb stood frozen, his hand pressed flat against the window, his face pale and tight like he was trying not to break down in front of the staff. He was 15, too young to leave, too old to believe anyone would come back for him. We weren't allowed to hug. Not really, not like we wanted to. Rules were rules. So I just nodded at him, like I was heading out for a normal day, like I'd be back by dinner, even though we both knew I wouldn't. "I'll figure something out," I mouthed, hoping he could read it through the glare. He nodded back, but his eyes said he didn't believe me. Honestly, neither did I. My caseworker, Mr. Hanley, handed me a manila envelope like it was paperwork and not my entire future. "There's your final stipend, $250, he said, already halfway turned toward the door. "And that letter came in for you. Something about property. Probably nothing, but it's yours." Property. The word sounded like it belonged to someone else's life. I didn't even open it at first. I just walked, my boots hitting pavement with no real destination. The weight of everything I owned slung over my shoulder in a bag that used to hold trash. I made it to a bus stop a few blocks away and sat there, staring at cars passing by like everyone else had somewhere to be, somewhere that mattered. That's when I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper from a county office I'd never heard of, in a photocopy of a map that looked like it had been dragged through time. It said my grandfather, someone I barely remembered, had left me a parcel of land. No house, no money, just land. 2 acres outside a town I couldn't pronounce, with a structure listed as Quonset hut, non-residential. To claim it, I had to show up in person and pay the remaining property taxes. Total owed, $5. I actually laughed out loud sitting there. $5. That wasn't property, that was a joke. But the longer I stared at it, the more it started to feel like something else. Not an opportunity exactly, but a direction. I could spend my $250 on a week in a motel and end up right back on the street, or I could spend $5 and at least have somewhere that was technically mine, even if it was just dirt and rust. I thought about Caleb standing behind that glass, counting on me to become something more than what we'd been handed. So I stood up, walked to the ticket machine, and bought a one-way bus ticket going the opposite direction of everything safe and predictable. The ride took hours. The city faded into long stretches of empty road, rolling hills, and endless sky that made me feel smaller with every mile. Nobody talked to me. I didn't expect them to. I was just another kid with a bag and nowhere to be. By the time I got off, the sun was already dipping low, painting everything in that dull orange light that makes even broken things look almost beautiful. The town was barely a town, just a gas station, a diner, and a few buildings that looked like they'd given up trying to stay new decades ago. I walked into the county office, handed over my $5, and signed papers I barely understood. The clerk didn't even look surprised. "You actually want it?" she asked. I shrugged. "It's mine, right?" She slid a rusted key across the counter. "Then I guess it is." Getting to the land wasn't simple. There was no proper road, just a dirt trail that turned into a path, and then into nothing. I walked for what felt like forever, my legs aching, my hands numb from the cold, until I finally pushed through a line of overgrown brush and saw it, the Quonset hut. It sat in the middle of a clearing like it had been forgotten on purpose, a curved metal shell streaked with rust, its surface eaten away by years of weather and neglect. It didn't look like a home. It looked like something people abandoned when they had better options. My heart sank a little. This was it. This was what $5 got me. I walked up to it slowly, half expecting it to collapse, just for me looking at it too hard. The front doors were chained shut, a thick rusted lock holding them together like the place was trying to keep something in, or maybe keep the world out. I pulled the key from my pocket, turning it over in my hand for a second, feeling its weight. This was the moment. Either I'd open it and find nothing but more disappointment, or something else entirely. I pushed the key into the lock. It resisted at first, like it hadn't been touched in years, then finally gave with a loud, grinding click that echoed in the silence around me. The chain fell away. I pulled one of the heavy doors open, the metal screaming against its hinges, and stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, untouched. Dust floated in the beam of light that slipped through the opening behind me, illuminating a wide, empty space that felt bigger than it had any right to be. There was nothing here. No furniture. No signs of life. Just concrete, shadows, and silence. I stood there, alone in the middle of it, realizing something that hit deeper than the cold ever could. This wasn't just a place. This was a starting line. And whether it turned into a home or a mistake was entirely up to me. The first time someone offered me $20,000 for that rusted Quonset hut, I was standing in the doorway with a hammer in my hand and mud on my boots, trying to convince myself the place wasn't falling apart faster than I could fix it. And for a second, just a second, I almost said yes, because $20,000 felt like escape, like warmth, like never having to wonder where I'd sleep again. But something about the way the man said it, like he already owned the answer, made me pause, and that pause changed everything. If you've ever been offered a shortcut out of a hard life, something that seemed too easy, too quick, then you know how dangerous that moment can be. The first few weeks in the hut had been brutal in ways I wasn't prepared for. The cold didn't just sit in the air, it lived in the concrete, in the metal walls, in my bones. At night, the wind would slam against the curved structure, making it groan like it was alive and angry I was there. I slept in layers, curled up in a corner I'd cleared of debris, using my bag as a pillow and my jacket as a blanket, waking up every few hours just to move so I wouldn't go numb. Food was whatever I could afford from the gas station back in town. Canned beans, stale bread, peanut butter if I was lucky. Water came from a creek nearly half a mile away, carried in a dented plastic container that cut into my hands on the walk back. Every single thing took effort. Every single step felt like it mattered more than anything I'd ever done before. But there was something else too, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. No one was telling me when to eat, when to sleep, what to do. If I failed here, it would be on me. And if I built something, that would be mine too. I started small, cleared out the inside, swept years of dust into piles that seemed to multiply no matter how much I worked. Found scraps of old wood near the back and used them to make a raised platform so I wouldn't have to sleep directly on the freezing floor. A guy at the hardware store in town, his name was Ray, noticed me coming in every couple of days buying the cheapest supplies I could find. He didn't ask too many questions, just started pointing me toward better options, showing me how to stretch a dollar without saying it out loud. One day he handed me a used wood stove that someone had traded in. "It ain't pretty," he said, "but it'll keep you alive." He wasn't wrong. Installing it nearly broke me. I had no idea what I was doing. Spent 2 days cutting a hole through the metal and rigging up a pipe using parts that didn't quite fit. But the first time I lit that fire and felt actual heat fill the space, I almost laughed. It wasn't just warmth. It was proof. Proof that this place could change. That I could change it. I started calling Caleb whenever I could, using a payphone near the gas station. I didn't tell him how bad it was at first. I told him about the stove, about the clearing, about how big the sky looked out here. I made it sound like an adventure because I needed him to believe it was one. "I'm going to make it into something," I told him once, gripping the receiver like it mattered. "And when I do, I'm coming back for you." There was a pause on the line, then his voice, quieter than I remembered. "You promise?" "Yeah," I said, even though I had no idea how I'd keep it. "I promise." That promise started to shape everything I did. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building something real enough that a judge, a system, anyone would have to take me seriously. Then came the offer. The man showed up in a clean truck that didn't belong on roads like these, wearing boots that had never seen mud. He looked at the hut like it was already gone. "You Ethan?" he asked, like he already knew. I nodded. He didn't waste time. "We're buying land in this area. Development project. Resorts, maybe housing. Your parcel's right in the middle of it." He pulled out a piece of paper. Like it was nothing. 20,000. Cash deal. We handle everything. 20,000. My mind immediately started racing. Apartment, food, maybe even a lawyer to start the process for Caleb. A real bed. A door that locked. A life that didn't involve freezing nights and hauling water. Why? I asked before I could stop myself. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Location's convenient. That's all you need to worry about. That was the moment it shifted. Because if it was really nothing, why pay that much? I'll think about it, I said, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression. Annoyance, maybe, or surprise. Don't take too long, he said. Offers like this don't wait around. He left, tires kicking up dust as he drove off, but his words stayed. That night, I couldn't sleep. $20,000 sat in my head like a weight, pressing against every doubt I had. What was I doing out here? Freezing, struggling, risking everything for a metal shell? But then I thought about how quickly he'd made the offer. How sure he was that I'd take it. And something about that didn't sit right. The next day, I started looking at the hut differently. Not just as something to fix, but as something to understand. That's when I noticed the locker. It had been there the whole time, bolted into the concrete floor near the back, half covered in dust and old debris. I'd ignored it before because it looked like junk, just another piece of the past left behind. But now it felt intentional, like it belonged here more than anything else. It took me nearly an hour to pry it open. The metal screamed as I forced it, my hands shaking more from anticipation than effort. When it finally gave, I expected tools, maybe old supplies, something simple. What I found instead changed everything. Inside were folders, thick, weathered, but carefully preserved. Maps, survey reports, handwritten notes, and a journal. My grandfather's name was written inside the cover. I sat down right there on the cold floor and started reading. The words were steady, precise, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He wrote about the land, about buying it cheap because no one saw its value, about waiting, about watching companies circle the area over the years. And then I found it, the reason. The land wasn't worthless, not even close. Beneath it ran a massive freshwater aquifer, clean, deep, and incredibly rare. Enough water to supply entire developments, entire towns. My hands actually trembled as I read it again, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't about land. It was about what was under it. And suddenly, the offer made sense. They weren't being generous. They were being strategic. They thought I didn't know. They thought I'd sell cheap and walk away before I ever realized what I had. I leaned back against the cold metal wall, the weight of it all settling in. The hut, the land, the struggle. It wasn't a mistake. It was something more. Something my grandfather had left on purpose. And for the first time since I'd stepped off that bus, I didn't feel like a kid trying to survive. I felt like someone standing in the middle of a fight they didn't start, but weren't going to lose. The day they offered me $300,000 to walk away, I stood in the doorway of that Quonset hut, our hut now, with real walls behind me, a working stove crackling in the corner, and a second bed I had built with my own hands for my brother, and I realized something that would have sounded impossible just months earlier. I didn't need their money, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one with nothing. They were the ones who needed something from me. If you've ever reached a moment where you finally understand your own worth, where you stop reacting and start deciding, then you know how quiet that kind of power feels. By then, everything had changed, but not all at once. It came piece by piece, just like the hut itself. After finding my grandfather's journal and the truth about the aquifer, I stopped thinking like someone trying to survive and started thinking like someone who owned something valuable, even if I didn't fully understand how to use it yet. I went back into town and showed the documents to the only person I trusted enough to not laugh me out the door, Ray at the hardware store. He didn't say much while flipping through the pages, but when he looked up, his expression was different. "Kid," he said slowly, "this ain't small. You need someone who knows what they're doing." That's how I ended up in the office of a local attorney named Denise Harper, a woman who had the kind of presence that made people choose their words more carefully. I expected her to dismiss me, to tell me it was all too complicated, too big, but she didn't. She read everything, asked questions I couldn't answer, and then leaned back in her chair with a look that told me the game had just changed. "They're not buying land," she said. "They're trying to secure water access, and they think you don't know it." That was the first time anyone said it out loud, and hearing it made everything sharper. Real. So what do I do? I asked. She smiled. Not kindly, not harshly, just knowingly. You don't sell. You make them negotiate. The next few months were a crash course in a world I had never imagined being part of. Contracts, permits, water rights, zoning laws. It felt like learning a new language while trying to build a house at the same time. But I didn't stop working on the hut. That part grounded me. While lawyers drafted letters and reviewed documents, I was out there insulating walls, reinforcing the structure, installing wiring with help from a retired electrician in town who decided I was worth his time. The place slowly stopped feeling like a shelter and started feeling like a home. I added a proper door, real windows, a small kitchen space, and that second bed. I built it carefully, measuring twice, making sure it was solid, because every nail I hammered into it was tied to a promise I hadn't forgotten. Caleb. I still called him whenever I could. This time, I told him more. Not everything, but enough. It's working, I said one night, standing outside under a sky full of stars I still wasn't used to. It's actually working. He was quiet for a second, then asked the only question that mattered. When can I come? That question pushed me harder than anything else. Because having land and potential wasn't enough, I needed stability. Proof. Something that would stand up in a courtroom, not just in my head. The company came back, just like Denise said they would. This time, they didn't send one man in a truck. They sent 2 suits and a proposal. $50,000, then $100,000. Each offer came with the same assumption, that I would eventually fold, that I didn't have the resources to hold out. But they didn't see what was happening behind the scenes. They didn't see the contracts being reviewed, the documents being strengthened, the way I was learning to hold my ground instead of giving it up. And they definitely didn't see the community slowly forming around me. People talk in small towns. They notice things. They saw a kid who didn't leave, who worked, who didn't sell out the moment money showed up. And that mattered. By the time the final meeting happened, I wasn't walking in alone anymore. Denise was there. So was Ray. Not because they had to be, but because they chose to stand with me. The offer slid across the table like it was inevitable. $300,000. Enough to erase every struggle I'd had. Enough to start over anywhere I wanted. The man across from me leaned back, confident. This is more than fair, he said. You won't get another offer like this. A few months ago, that number would have owned me. But now, all I could think about was what I'd built. The hut, the land, the future it represented. And Caleb. Always Caleb. I looked at Denise. She gave a small nod. Not telling me what to do, just reminding me I had a choice. So I pushed the paper back. I'm not selling, I said. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. The man's expression tightened. Then what exactly are you planning to do? That's when I told them. Not from fear. Not from desperation. From understanding. You don't need the land, I said. You need the water. So here's the deal. You get access. Not ownership. You pay to build the system. You pay to maintain it. And I keep control. They stared at me like I'd just rewritten the rules of a game they thought they already won. That's not how this works, one of them said. I shook my head. It is now. It didn't end that day. There were more meetings, more negotiations, more pressure. But the balance had shifted. They needed what I had, and they knew it. Eventually, they agreed. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no better option. The contract we signed didn't just secure my future. It created something bigger. Income. Stability. A foundation that couldn't be taken away with a single decision. The day the first payments came through, I didn't celebrate. I went back to the hut, stood in the doorway, and just looked at it. Really looked. The rust was still there in places. The structure still carried its past. But it wasn't broken anymore. It was something else entirely. A home. A beginning. The court date for Caleb came a few weeks later. I walked in wearing the only decent clothes I owned. Hands steady in a way they hadn't been the day I turned 18. This time, I wasn't asking for a chance. I was showing one. The judge looked at everything. The property, the income, the letters from people in town, the proof that I could provide more than just a roof. And when he made the decision, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt right. Walking out of that building with Caleb beside me was the moment everything finally landed. Not the money, not the land. This. We drove back together. The truck bouncing along the same rough path I had walked alone months before. When we reached the clearing, Caleb just stared. This is it, he asked. I nodded. He stepped out, looking at the hut, the porch, the smoke rising from the chimney. "You built this?" he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. I smiled, not because it was impressive, but because it was ours. "Yeah," I said. "We did." And standing there beside him, I realized the truth of it all. We didn't just buy a Quonset hut for $5. We built a future out of something everyone else thought was worthless. And in the process, we changed too.